about 20 minutes to do this, I would do that, and it'll probably have to be later today because of the clock that's running now. So I will yield the floor for my friend to take his turn.
The senator from Colorado is recognized.
Madam President, good afternoon. I rise this afternoon in support of the Bipartisan Cybersecurity Act of 2012, and I want to share my concerns about the very real cyber threat facing our country. Most importantly, I rise to urge all of my colleagues to move forward to the passage of this pending cybersecurity bill for the good of our national security. Top experts and respected members of both political parties have told us that time is wasting. We must debate and pass this critically important piece of legislation. Cybersecurity policy is an issue with which I am deeply involved, given my seats on the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. Moreover, Colorado's military and defense communities play a prominent role in defending our country, the United States, against cyber attacks. The Air Force Space Command, located at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, is responsible for protecting American space-based assets from network intrusions. The U.S. Northern Command, also located at Peterson Air Force Base, recently established a joint cyber center to help provide on-demand cyber consequence response to civil authorities. Multiple defense and technology industry companies based in Colorado also contribute hardware, software, and expertise to the effort to keep our networks and infrastructure secure. Our federal labs also conduct critical research into cybersecurity, most notably the National Institute of Standards and Technology, otherwise known as NIST, which is located in Boulder. They play a key role in helping establish cybersecurity standards. The threats posed by cyber attacks, Madam President, have long been recognized, but we in the Congress have yet to act upon these threats in a comprehensive way. It is as if we see the danger in front of us, but yet we cannot find the courage to face it. But Congress cannot afford to wait for a 9/11-sized attack in order to act. Waiting for a catastrophic act, something that military and intelligence leaders and a bipartisan collection of national security experts are warning us against, is the exact opposite of leadership and the exact opposite of what our constituents expect us to do here. Now, Madam President, this debate, to me, has seemingly, unfortunately, unraveled into an antiquated argument about the public sector versus the private sector. We can't let old ways of thinking bog us down. This is a threat that can only be addressed by both the public and private sectors working together. The private sector owns 85% of our nation's critical infrastructure, which is itself heavily dependent on computer networks. A successful attack on our critical infrastructure could result in disabled power grids, refineries and nuclear plants, disrupted rail systems, and air traffic control and telecommunications networks. A successful attack could bring commerce to a halt, our financial markets to their knees. It could also escalate into a war in cyberspace or even a shooting war. To defend against these serious threats, particularly those that involve national security, there needs to be an exchange of information between the public and the private sectors. And of course, allowing the government and industry to share information must be done with sufficient safeguards. So any legislation authorizing such sharing needs to strike a balance between privacy and civil liberties protections. Now, I believe the bill's authors have achieved such a balance. I recognize that it's often difficult to find consensus on how to defend our nation from security threats. Sometimes that is because we can't agree on the nature of our vulnerabilities and in what priority to address them. And unfortunately, sometimes Congress is too polarized to act until after a crisis occurs. But, Madam President, in the case of cybersecurity, we already know our nation's computer networks are increasingly vulnerable. There is widespread agreement about the severity of the threat. Just last month, Defense Secretary Panetta testified before Congress that cyber attacks could virtually paralyze this country. The threat isn't impending, It is here. And we already know many of the steps we need to take to mitigate or prevent these attacks. The only thing getting in the way is politics. Frankly, Madam President, Coloradans are tired of this. They want us to reason together and solve our most vexing national challenges. The Cybersecurity Act of 2012 is not overly intrusive. It has been scaled back to a voluntary system of industry-driven security standards for critical infrastructure. The bill's authors have offered a further amendment to address some of the remaining concerns of the bill's opponents. And as much as the bill's authors have compromised and worked with groups and businesses from across the policy spectrum, you would think they would get more in return from the Republicans than a demand to vote on the repeal of health care reform. But that's where the debate stands today, and it's not a proud moment for our chamber. Madam President, the cybersecurity bill before us may not be perfect. In fact, I've offered 3 amendments that I believe make this an even stronger bill. The first would require the administration to provide a detailed plan on how it will develop a highly trained, robust federal cybersecurity workforce. A stronger federal workforce will not only better protect government assets, but these individuals will go on to fill critical roles protecting cyber assets in the private sector. My second amendment would establish permanent faculty positions to train the next generation of military cyber leaders at the U.S. Air Force Academy. My third amendment would require the assessment of the costs and benefits of building a strategic stockpile of extra high-voltage transformers. We don't produce these highly specialized pieces of equipment domestically, and it would take months to replace transformers damaged by a physical or cyber attack. I hope that my colleagues will join me in passing these common-sense amendments aimed at improving our national security. This cybersecurity bill is over 3 years in the making. I find it ironic that some argue that the process has been rushed and that we need more time. But I believe this bill is long overdue and that we simply cannot afford not to act. As the head of U.S. Cyber Command and the director of the National Security Agency, General Alexander, wrote in a letter to Congress this week, the cyber threat facing the nation is real and demands immediate action. This is coming from the national security official who knows more than anyone about the cyber threats facing our country. As a member of the Intelligence Committee, I take his cautions and advice very seriously. The rest of us should as well. Madam President, as I close, I urge all of us, let's put aside partisan ploys and partisan differences. Let's work together to amend and pass this vitally important cybersecurity bill. Madam President, I yield the floor. Madam President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Madam President, I understand that the floor time is pretty much used up between now and 6:30, and I have made inquiries. And so I understand I'll have time at 6:30 for 25 minutes. And so I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized as at 6:30 for such time for 25 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
There's nobody else on the floor now. I understand that the next speakers are in the cloakroom at this time, so I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
I thought you were trying to tell him, don't take the 6:30. You're looking at me, and I'm like, This senator from Vermont is recognized.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the privilege of the floor be granted to the following member of my staff.
Senator, we are in a quorum call.
I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I ask consent that Jasper Craven of my staff be given the privilege of the floor for the rest of the day.
Without objection, so ordered.
And, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Jeanette Quick, a detailee of Banking Committee staff, as well as Ingiani Augusta and Georgina Kanan, two interns on Senator Johnson's staff, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of today's session. And I make that last request on behalf of the senator from South Dakota. Madam President, unfortunately, we have not seen many times when we've seen legislation passed by solid bipartisan majorities, with some notable exceptions. And it's been more than 3 months since an overwhelming majority of the Senate joined us in our bipartisan effort, passed the Leahy-Crapo Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2011. 68 votes, more than two-thirds of this body, including every woman senator, Republican, Democratic. When we did that, the Senate sent a very clear message. We said stopping domestic and sexual violence is a national priority. And that we're going to stand together, Republicans and Democrats alike, to protect all victims from these devastating crimes. All victims. It's very clear. If you're a victim of domestic and sexual violence, we're passing laws to help protect you, no matter where you were in this country. Having sent such a strong bipartisan message from this body, I don't know whether to say bewildered or shocked to see the House Republican leadership abandon the bipartisan approach that was so successful in the Senate. Actually, the Speaker and the Republican leadership in the House insist on ignoring victims and the voices of the professionals in the field, actually many voices in both the Republican and Democratic Party, and continues to delay this crucial legislation on a technicality. Technicality is then waived over and over and over again since I've been here in the Senate. I think the Senate should once again lead by example. And we can solve this problem tonight, Madam President, tonight, within the next few hours. The Senate Republican leadership wants to get VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, done. It can be done. We could take up a House revenue bill, substitute the bipartisan Senate VAWA bill, and send it to the House immediately. Now, to those who are watching or listening, this may sound like, what are these legislative moves? What they are is a simple thing that I've seen done hundreds of times since I've been here. And it'd be our way of saying we want to stop violence against women. We have passed a bill that had Republicans and Democrats come together across the political spectrum. Now we're saying to the other body and say, follow our example. Majority Leader Reid proposed this path forward nearly 2 months ago, but he's blocked by the Republican side. So what I'm saying is that just as 68 of us came together, Republicans and Democrats before, I would urge the Republican leadership to stop blocking this from coming forward. We have only a precious few days left in this Congress to get this bill passed. The procedural excuses must stop. The partisan politicking must end. Just as Senator Crapo and I, two senators of different political philosophies, came together when we started this process so many months ago, we came together to focus on the victims, but also make good on our promise to stop domestic and sexual violence in all its forms and against all victims. Madam President, I've said so many times on this floor, this matter is deeply personal. I went to a lot of these crime scenes as a young prosecutor with a young family. And when I would see a victim of violence, sometimes a bloodied and barely conscious victim being taken in an ambulance to the hospital, but more times seeing a bloody corpse on the floor. And then we find out as we unravel that had we had programs like we have in the Violence Against Women Act today, that we're reauthorizing, that had strong support from Republicans and Democrats in the past, if we had had one of those programs at that time, that we would not have had a dead body on the floor. Madam President, what I also learned is that the police officers who came to help investigate that and help get the perpetrator, they never asked, was this victim a Republican or a Democrat, rich or poor, white or black, gay or straight, Native American, immigrant, whatever. They just said, as I've said so many times on the floor, and the distinguished presiding officer who herself was a prosecutor has said, a victim is a victim is a victim. I don't want just to be able to arrest people after the person is dead. I want programs to stop the person from being abused in the first place. I want to protect victims before they become victims. Madam President, if there is anything in this country that should unite all of us, it should be this. Just as it united 68 of us before, let's send it on to the other body. Let's get it passed. Let's get it on the President's desk. And let's hope we save the lives of people. And with that, Madam President, I see other senators on the floor. I ask consent my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. And I'm really honored to follow the senator from Vermont, who has been such an extraordinary leader in this area, and look forward to yielding shortly to the senator from Washington, who has championed this bill and helped us all to see the urgency of approving it. In the minutes that I will be talking, and they will be brief minutes, every minute, 9 women will become victims of domestic abuse. Every minute that I am standing here, every minute that we occupy with debate and delay on this measure, 9 people in the United States, the greatest country in the history of the world, we become victims of domestic violence. We cannot afford to wait, and that is why I urge that my colleagues advance this critical piece of legislation and urge the House of Representatives to agree to the Senate version of this bill so that we can make this bill more inclusive to include Native Americans and immigrants and others who would not be covered by the House version. We find ourselves at a crossroads. We can either strengthen VAWA or we can retreat and go back. And I say, let us go forward with the philosophy that the senator from Vermont has just articulated so well as a prosecutor. Not to mention knowing how our police work, we don't ask whether somebody is an immigrant, what their sexual preference is, whether they are a Native American. We protect them if they are victims of domestic abuse and violence. And that should be our philosophy in the greatest country in the history of the world. There are two protections for battered immigrant women in VAWA that are particularly important. The first allows immigrant women married to an abusive United States citizen to apply for legal status independent of that spouse. The second, which is the U visa, provides temporary status to victims who cooperate with law enforcement to prosecute their abuser. The reauthorization of VAWA is currently stalled principally because of the U visa provisions in the Senate bill, S. 1925. Let me illustrate the importance of this provision with one story. A woman who came to Connecticut from Guatemala fled her native country to escape her abuser and arrived in Connecticut in 2005. Her abuser followed her to Connecticut. He continued to abuse her. He was eventually deported to Guatemala on criminal charges, but she found herself in another abusive relationship and eventually was able to find shelter at a domestic violence agency. She could not convince a family to sponsor her so that she could apply for legal status. She would have nowhere to turn but for the transitional living facility and program for domestic violence, and she was connected to a legal aid attorney who then enabled her to file for a U visa. I'm happy to report that this constituent survivor received her U visa in May of 2012, and because of VAWA, she is now safe, and so is her son. This story is repeated countless times across Connecticut and the country by women who suffer in silence. Their undocumented status makes them particularly vulnerable and powerless to escape their abusive situations. My constituents tell me, and I want to listen to them, that we cannot afford to compromise those basic protections that are fundamental to human rights and dignity. And that is why I urge this body and the Congress as a whole to move forward, not backward. Again, every minute, 9 women, 9 people in this great country become victims of domestic violence. The consequences of this horrific problem are too high and the costs are too dire to stay the course and simply repeat the inaction that we have seen so far. Thousands of victims of domestic violence are entrusting us with their safety today. We have an obligation to them to avoid the gamesmanship, to end the gridlock, and move forward with S. 1925. And Madam President, I thank you and I yield the floor.
The senator from Washington is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I want to thank Senator Leahy and Senator Blumenthal and so many others who come to the floor to speak on this really critical issue. Madam President, today the women of the Senate and the men who support the Violence Against Women Act are here on the floor to give Speaker Boehner and the Republicans another chance to do the right thing. It's another chance to stop the delay. It's another chance to provide the peace of mind to 30 million women whose protections are at risk, and it's another chance to pass the inclusive, bipartisan Senate Violence Against Women Act bill. Madam President, the bipartisan Senate bill passed almost 100 days ago by a vote here in the Senate of 68 to 31. 15 of our Republican colleagues on the floor, let me repeat that, 15 Republicans joined us that day, and they did so because they know the history of this bill. They know that every time the Violence Against Women Act has been reauthorized, it has consistently included bipartisan provisions to address the women that have not been protected. They know that domestic violence protections for all women shouldn't be a Democratic or Republican issue. But here we are, back on the Senate floor, urging support today for a bill that should not be controversial. And just as we did last week, just as we are doing today, and just as we will do in the coming weeks, we will be making sure this message resonates loud and clear, both here in Washington, D.C., and back home in all of our states, because we are not going to back down, not while there are thousands of women in the country who are excluded from the current law. Madam President, the numbers are staggering. 1 in 3 Native Americans will be raped in their lifetime. 1 in 3 Native Americans will be raped in their lifetime. 2 in 5 of them are victims of domestic violence, and they are killed at 10 times the rate of the national average. And those shocking statistics aren't isolated to one group of women. 25 to 35% of women in the LGBT community experience domestic violence in their relationships. 3 in 4 of immigrant women who are abused never enter the process to obtain legal status, even though they are eligible. Why? Because their abuser husbands never filed their paperwork. So this should make it perfectly clear to our colleagues in the other chamber that their current inaction has a real impact on the lives of women across America affected by violence. Where a person lives, their immigration status, who they love, should not determine whether or not their perpetrator of domestic violence is brought to justice. Madam President, last week, the New York Times ran an editorial on the bill that gets to the heart of where we are, and it began by saying, quote, House Republicans have to decide which is more important, protecting victims of domestic violence or advancing the harsh anti-gay and anti-immigrant sentiments of some of their party's far right. And at the moment, harshness is winning. But the editorial also made the point that it does not have to be this way and pointed out, and I quote, in May, 15 Senate Republicans joined with the Chamber's Democratic majority to approve a strong reauthorization bill. And finally, that editorial ended with what we all know it will take to move this bill forward: leadership from Congressman Boehner. And Madam President, today the effort we started here in the Senate last week, an effort that will continue for as long as it takes, is a call for the very same thing: leadership. It's time for Speaker Boehner to look beyond ideology and partisan politics. It's time for him to look at the history of a bill that again and again has been supported and expanded by Republicans and Democrats, and end the delay, because frankly it's taking a toll. Every moment that the House continues to delay is another moment that 30 million vulnerable women are left without the protections they deserve in this country. Madam President, the women this bill protects have seen their lives destroyed by the cowardice of those who claimed to care for them. We have the chance now to stand up for them where others have not. But the only way that we can help protect these women is to prove that as a nation we have the courage to do so, the courage to show them that discrimination has no place in our domestic violence laws. And to do that, we need to pass the Senate's Inclusive Bipartisan Violence Against Women Act.
Will my friend yield before she makes her unanimous consent request?
I would yield to the Senator.
So I have some questions. I want to make sure everyone who's listening to this debate gets what's about to happen now. Is it not true that the Senate passed a bipartisan Leahy-Crapo Violence Against Women Act with well more than 60 votes? Is that correct?
The senator from California is correct.
Is it not correct that the House passed its version and left out 30 million Americans?
The senator is correct. In fact, those 30 million Americans would be covered under the Senate bill. We make sure that Native American women are covered. We put in important provisions to make sure that campus violence is covered, and those provisions have been left out of the House bill.
Yes, and the immigrant women, as you have discussed, who, as Senator Blumenthal pointed out, are the most vulnerable because they're so afraid of their status. They're very scared to report that someone is raping them, beating them, harming them every single day. Is that not correct?
The senator from California is absolutely correct. We cannot even imagine what it's like to have somebody hold that kind of power over you and use it to beat you day in and day out. We cover those women in this bill so they have the protections that they ought to have as human beings.
So is it not fair to say that the 30 million people that we cover that the House leaves out include college students, enhanced protections for them on campus, LGBT community, Native American women, and undocumented immigrants? Is that correct?
The senator from California is correct.
And as my friend pointed out, is it not true that when you look at the rates of violence against these particular people in our community, they are higher than the population at large?
The senator from California is correct.
So isn't it fair to say that the House bill, their version of the Violence Against Women Act, left out the most vulnerable people who are the most susceptible to violence?
The senator from California is correct, and that is what we have worked to do in a bipartisan fashion in the Senate to make sure that in this country of America that we do not discriminate against women when it comes to violence.
And I just have two more points, and then I'm going to yield back my question time to my friend so she can make a unanimous consent request. Isn't it also true that the excuse that Speaker Boehner is giving as to why he won't take up and pass the Senate bill, the bipartisan Senate bill, the Leahy-Crapo bill, isn't it true that the excuse that he is giving is the fact that there is a technical problem, which he calls a blue slip, in the Senate bill? And isn't it true that my friend today is going to ask unanimous consent to correct that problem so that we can send this inclusive bill over to Speaker Boehner? Is that correct?
Well, the senator from California is correct. It seems to me such a simple procedure to do, which we have done many times here in the United States Senate, to just by unanimous consent send the Speaker back a bill so he can't put a piece of blue paper in front of us and say that stands between women and the protections that we are trying to pass for them today.
So finally, I would say this. I would hope that when my friend makes a unanimous consent request to take the very same text of the Violence Against Women Act that passed this body with well over 60 votes and put it into a bill that would now overcome the technical problem and enable us to send to the House, it is my strong hope that the Republican leadership will not object. And if they do, let the whole country understand what they are objecting to, a way to fix this technical problem so that Speaker Boehner and the Republicans can pass the Senate Bipartisan Violence Against Women Act and include 30 million people who have been left out. I thank my friend for yielding.
And I would thank the senator from California and say she's absolutely correct. What I'm about to do is to ask consent, similar to what we've done on many pieces of legislation, including the Transportation and Jobs bill that the senator from California was able to pass, and the Senate overcame that technicality through a motion on the floor. We have done it time and time again on bills like that. It seems to me that on a bill like this that is affecting so many women and their right to protect themselves and their ability to get help in their communities to support them should not have a technicality between themselves and our passing in this country protections for them. So having said that, Madam President, I now ask unanimous consent that the Finance Committee be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 9 and the Senate proceed to its consideration, that all after the enacting clause be stricken and the language of S. 1925, the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization as passed in the Senate on April 26 by a vote of 68 to 31, be inserted in lieu thereof, that the bill as amended be read a third time and passed, the motions to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and any statements related to the bill to be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Is there objection?
Madam President,
The senator from Iowa.
rather than doing the usual thing of reserving the right to object, I will object, and then I would appreciate the courtesy before I offer a parallel UC to make my remarks.
Madam President, if I understood the
Senator from Washington.
the senator from Iowa has objected to my request.
The objection has been heard.
Madam President.
This
Madam President.
senator from Washington.
Madam President, the senator from Iowa has objected. I just have to say that it is stunning to me that the senator has objected to a simple procedure that we have done many times on transportation bills and FAA bills, and that leaves us the inability to provide the protections for the women that we have been talking about.
Madam President.
Senator from Iowa.
I'm going to make a unanimous consent request dealing with the same subject, but before I do that, I'm kind of astounded that it took 100 days for the majority to decide that the bill that they wanted to send to the House would be blue-slipped, because they kept saying so long, well, it really wasn't subject to blue-slip. Well, obviously, the Constitution gives the House of Representatives the power to make that decision, and they made the decision that the fee that's in this bill would keep it from being accepted by the House of Representatives. Now, they obviously overcome that problem, but they haven't overcome some other problems that are with the legislation, and my reason for objecting for people on my side that voted against this bill because of some unconstitutional provisions that are in it, and issues that don't have to be brought up to guarantee that there's adequate legislation for fighting violence against women. And by the way, an act that's been on the books for about more than a decade and a half, I believe, is going to be carried on. So there's not going to be a situation where, whether we go through this process or not, that there's not going to be legislation protecting women on the books. It's just a question, will it be expanded in a way that was intended to make this bill controversial, so presumably it could be made a political issue in an election. But what bothers me about this whole process, besides the fact that it's taken 100 days now to get to the point of offering for conference, it fits into a pattern of doing things at the last minute. Now, we're 2 days away from a recess. And this is brought up at this particular time. I have to ask why. Why not sometime during the last 100 days? And I would also see a pattern of this maneuver fitting into the maneuvers that have been going on ever since, I believe, the spring break that we had in the United States Senate. Ever since then, and this kind of follows an article that was in the newspaper we know as Political, that was about a couple months ago, the strategy between the White House re-election effort and things that go on in the United States Senate. We seem to have a crisis every week. We came back from the spring break. We had the Buffett tax rule. That carried on for a week. Nobody knew that. Everybody knew that wasn't going to pass, but we wasted a whole week on the Buffett tax rule. And then this issue was brought up before and passed about that time. And at that particular time, the strategy of people having war on women came up as an issue. And that ended in this legislation being passed through the Senate, but in a way where everybody knew it wasn't going to get through the House of Representatives, but as a very convenient political issue. And then later on, we had the Equal Wages for Women legislation that came up for about a week. And everybody knew that that wasn't going to go anyplace, but it was a debate in this Assembly taking up the time on a lot of important issues that ought to be used with the economy and creating jobs, and we spent a week on that. And then we spent a week on taxing the rich, and nobody knew that. Everybody knew that wasn't going to go anyplace. And I think we spent a month on interest on student loans, that everybody knew that there was a bipartisan solution to it, but nobody wanted to go there until the president had a whole month going to university campuses to blame Republicans for not passing a bill that would keep interest on student loans free. And then we spent last week on the Disclose Act, and nobody knew that, everybody knew that that wasn't going to go anyplace. So we've had a whole spring and summer in this body of accomplishing nothing because there's a strategy between the White House and the leadership of the Senate to help this president get reelected and keep the issues off of what the people of this country are concerned about, and that is the economy and creating jobs. And the fact that this White House and this Senate isn't going to do anything to work through those issues. So in the Senate, it's an issue of politics and not an issue of product. And I think the American people know what the games are being played and are sick and tired of it. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 406, H.R. 4970, the House passed Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, provided further that all after the enacting clause be stricken. The text of the Senate passed Violence Against Women Bill S. 1925 with modifications that strike Section 805 and 810 related to the immigration provisions, that the bill be read 3 times and passed, and the Senate insist on its amendments, request a conference with the House, and the chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate with a ratio agreed to by both leaders.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
The senator from Washington.
I object. Mr. President,
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I have listened carefully to the passion from the senator from Iowa on behalf of the Republican majority and Speaker Boehner. And frankly, I have to say it is offensive to say that the issue of violence against women is about politics. This is about women who are abused, women who are powerless to fight back, women being able to get the protections that they need in this country that has provided protection for a very long time, to make sure that women who are immigrants, women who live on in a tribe, women who are gay and lesbian, women who are on college campuses get the protections they support. This is not about politics. This is about violence, and this country stand up and say we're going to protect them. Make no mistake about it. What they are saying is that they want to move this bill to conference so that they can strip those provisions out. Well, they've crossed a line that in history of this non-political, bipartisan bill has been so deeply important to so many of us. They made this bill about politics just now. I find that offensive. They want to take the Senate's bipartisan, passed by Republicans and Democrats here, and take it to conference and pick it apart. They want to take it to conference so they can have a discussion about which women in this country deserve protection and which don't. They want to pit one group of women against another. That's not a game. It's not politics, and it's not what I'm going to play. The new protections in this bill that have been supported by Republicans and Democrats and groups across this country and millions of Americans are not bartering chips, and it is not about politics. The objection of the senator on behalf of the Republicans raises issues that really are nothing more than a smokescreen, and they don't want to be out in front saying that they're willing to discriminate against certain women, that they'd rather hide behind these procedural objections. But I would remind all of our colleagues, these procedural objections that they're out here talking about, these politics, they've been routinely overcome here in the Senate. Just as I said a few minutes ago, the Transportation and Jobs Bill that we passed a month ago, the blue slip issue, overcome. FAA reauthorization last year, funding our nation's airports, overcome. Food Safety Act, overcome. Travel Promotion Act, all of those had blue slip issues. All of them were overcome, and there was a reason why. Leadership and the will to do the right thing. So let me make it abundantly clear. Mr. President, This is not about politics. It's about protecting women in this country. It's about making sure that we do the right thing in this country for so many women who are looking here to the Congress of the United States to have us put in place the protections that they deserve. Well, the ball is in the court now of the Speaker. He's going to have to talk to women across the country about why their protections are at risk because of politics. But I want everyone to be clear. We are not going to compromise on the issues that are so important to so many women and throw them under the bus. That's not what we have fought for year after year on bipartisan legislation when we passed the Violence Against Women Act before. It is inclusive. It is bipartisan. It is above ideology and partisan games. It is a bill that makes sure that no matter who you are or where you live or who you love, you are protected under the great country that we live in. Politics has no place in this. I would agree with the senator from Iowa. Who's playing politics? We'll leave it up to those who are watching. What I've asked you today is to simply ask the Senate to do what we have done many times on many bills, to move this bill to the House on a bipartisan way and pass it, and then politics won't matter. Women are covered. I hope that our Senate colleagues who have objected and the Speaker will reconsider. They can easily pass this bill today or next month, put it into place, and women in this country can say that the leaders of this country are fighting for them. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that the privilege of the floor be granted to the following members of my staff, Kareem Yacoub and Razin Jalal, if you would, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President.
Minnesota.
I ask to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
I just want to do one thing in terms of respond to Senator Grassley, who's a friend, and we enjoy a very good relationship on judiciary and are just friends. But the idea that these provisions, these new provisions in the VAWA bill are just political, it just couldn't be further from the truth. You know, there's one provision, I'll just talk about one provision. It's about women on Indian reservations who get abused by a partner, a boyfriend, a husband who isn't native. And this happens all the time. And this gave jurisdiction to the tribes to prosecute this. And I'm on Indian Affairs. I talk to tribal leaders all the time. I go to reservations all the time. You just have no idea how grateful tribal leaders were and how important this was. You know, 1 out of every 3 women in Indian country, 1 out of 3 Indian women in this country are raped at some time in their life. And by far, the largest majority of that is not by male Indians. It's by non-Indians. I can't think of anything less political. I just can't. And I just ask my colleagues to think, to give a second of thought before they say stuff like that. It really is, Senator Murray said it was offensive to her. You know, I just find it, I actually found it more sad. I mean, I find it sad.
I came to the floor to talk about diabetes. Mr. President, as you know so well, the presiding officer, Senator Whitehouse, has been such a champion in talking about the money that can be saved in our health care system by prevention. And we can prevent chronic disease. The burden of chronic disease in our country is staggering. Chronic disease affects half of all American adults, and 7 out of 10 deaths each year are due to chronic disease. If current trends continue, by the year 2020, 52% of American adults will either have type 2 diabetes or elevated glucose levels that's known as prediabetes. And diabetes can often lead to other chronic diseases such as heart disease. But as grim as these statistics are for our country, we also have some of the best healthcare researchers in the world. A few years ago, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, conducted a pilot program called the Diabetes Prevention Program in 2 cities, in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Indianapolis, Indiana. This program, which was administered by the YMCA, is a 16-session program focusing on nutritional training, eating healthy, 16 weeks of training, eating healthy, and 16 weeks of physical activity at a Y. And it costs about $300 per participant. Now, the results of this pilot were extraordinary. Among adults with prediabetes, who are at the highest risk for developing type 2 diabetes, the program reduced the chances that a participant would be diagnosed with diabetes by 58%. And for adults over the age of 60, reduced the likelihood of being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes by 71%. That's why Senator Lugar and I introduced legislation in 2009 to authorize the National Diabetes Prevention Program as a grant program through the CDC. This bill was passed as part of the health care law and is helping community-based organizations like the YMCA, administer the program across the country. Now, no one can participate in this program if it's not available, which is why we needed the CDC to help expand the program, to scale it up. And thanks to their work and to our provision in the Affordable Care Act, the YMCA is now offering the Diabetes Prevention Program at more than 300 sites in 30 states. We also need health insurers to pay for the program in order to make sure that everyone who needs it can get it. We know that when eligible adults participate in the program, it saves everyone money. In fact, the CEO of United Healthcare told me that they'll cover this. And why? Because they save $4 for every dollar they invest in the program, because their beneficiaries are healthier. And the Urban Institute estimated that implementing community programs like the Diabetes Prevention Program could save $191 billion nationally, $191 billion, with 75% of the savings, more than $142 billion, going to Medicare and Medicaid programs. That's why the federal government should also invest in this cost-saving program for seniors. Nearly 1/3 of Medicare beneficiaries had diabetes in 2010. And the Diabetes Prevention Program costs, again, about $300 per participant as compared to more than $6,000 a year in added health care costs for someone with type 2 diabetes. There's no question that by preventing diabetes, we can all save money while keeping our seniors healthier. That's why I introduced legislation yesterday with my friends Senator Lugar, Rockefeller, Collins, and Shaheen to allow Medicare to cover the National Diabetes Prevention Program. We're doing this to help our seniors enjoy their golden years while staying as healthy as possible. We're also doing it because it's the fiscally responsible thing to do. That's why the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, the American Public Health Association, and the American Council on Aging have all endorsed this legislation. The National Association of Chronic Disease Directors, the National Association of State Long-Term Care Ombudsman Programs, and the YMCA of the USA have also endorsed the bill, as have 79 state and local organizations. We know a really good way to prevent type 2 diabetes, and we know how to do it while saving the federal government billions of dollars. In fact, we know doing it will save the federal government billions of dollars. So, Mr. President, let's all here work together to prevent chronic disease in our country. I urge you, Mr. President, and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in guaranteeing that every senior has access to the diabetes prevention program when they need it. Mr. President, I'd also like to just take a moment to recognize that today is the 5th anniversary of a tragedy in my home state, the collapse of the Interstate 35W bridge in Minneapolis. The collapse killed 13 people and injured 145 others. The collapse was a shock to Minnesotans and I think to the country. How could a bridge on our interstate highway system collapse in our country? It underscores the importance, of course, of investing in our infrastructure. And we did move quickly to replace the bridge with a beautiful bridge, and thanks to the leadership of Senator Klobuchar and others. I just want to say just a couple things about this. The response by the people and the first responders in Minneapolis and in the metropolitan area. It was amazing. All the first responders had interoperable radio signals. People ran to the bridge. People in Minneapolis ran to the bridge to help. People did heroic things. I'm very proud of Minnesota. I'm proud of Mayor Ryback and the response of other first responders in the metropolitan area. I'm so proud to represent Minnesota. And also my heart goes out to the families of those who perished that day, and also to their loved ones, their friends, but also to the survivors who are still recovering in so many different ways. So I urge my colleagues not to forget that day, to remember that we need to invest in our infrastructure. And just hope this doesn't happen, to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
The Senator from New York.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the Senator from Minnesota
for his great remarks.